Hello and welcome back to Preserving Life here with Family and Life. We are going to have a conversation today. I'm very delighted to be joined by Dr. Michał Pruski, who is an expert on the issue of assisted dying, euthanasia, and the administration of extraordinary care. It's a big issue, obviously, at the moment in Ireland. But before we start, I'd like to draw your attention to two things. First of all, if you could just click on that subscribe button, that would be great. That means that any new material comes up, new videos or conversations, that you will be alerted. The other thing is we're facing into another battle here again. We're going to need your help to fight that battle. So the donate button is there. If you can click on that, anything you can give us will make a real difference to the work that we do and will be spent wisely and well, I can assure you. Anyway, thanks. So Dr. Michał Pruski, thank you very much for joining us. So you're, at the moment, I believe we're talking to you from Wales, which is isn't yet in full lockdown, but about to go in. And if I'm right, the only other place in the Western world where you can't go to Mass.
Well, yes, certainly Mass will be out of question here. I think you can go for weddings and funerals. I don't think there's anything available for baptisms. So we managed to get our little one baptized last week. so just about before all of this. So
congratulations are in order.
Thank you.
And the blessing and all good blessings to yourself, your wife, and to your little one. So if we start off, just can we get a little bit of sense of Dr. Pruski, where you're from, your family background, and your education? What has brought you to where you are today?
Well, I think I'm very much, I guess, what you could describe a third culture kid. So I was born in the Netherlands, then ended up living in Belgium, then went back to my homeland of Poland. But I finished sixth form in England, and then moved to university to Scotland, where I did both my undergraduate. I started originally as an ecologist, but ended up as a neuroscientist. And then that was in Edinburgh, and then I moved to Aberdeen, and then I ended up on a dually accredited PhD program, spending some time in Tongji in Shanghai, in China. But during my medical sciences PhD, I developed an interest in bioethics. So I started off by doing some volunteering for a couple of UK-based organizations, just to build up a bit of, I don't know-how about the area. And then I completed a master's in bioethics and medical law at St. Mary's, Twickenham in London, which I always say was my favorite degree. And after that, I entered into the NHS clinical scientist training program in critical care, which I have recently completed. So that was more patient-facing work in healthcare rather than research or anything like that. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I also had a residence permit at some point in Tanzania, where I taught first aid and did other smaller ventures here and there. But that's me in a nutshell.
Okay, so I think it's curious that you spent time in both the Netherlands and Belgium, because I think for many of us, when we think of this particular subject, this is the starting, the kickoff ground there for so much of both the activity and the thinking about it. I often encounter people that I find when I look at their CVs, I think, well, how did you get all this done? What have I been doing with my time? And I think your CV is one of those. I find it kind of depressing. You have the undergrad, as you said, just to recap for the audience, an undergrad, the undergrad from Aberdeen a dual PhD program from in Songye, which I discovered is one of the most prestigious universities in China, along with, of course, a very prestigious university. Anyway, what you were doing, then a master's in ethics from St. Mary's in Twickenham, and then an MSc in clinical science. What is that? Your last degree. What does that involve?
It's the most difficult question that people ask. Clinical scientists are a group of healthcare professionals in the UK that are, it's a regulated profession, so you have to be on the register to practice. It's actually quite a wide profession, and like even for the training, you generally train already within a specialism. But it's mainly to aid in a lot of the work is aiding in the diagnostics process, but there's also a lot of scientific support for clinical interventions, which depending where you work, you might be dealing with complex, advanced lab tests, or you might be helping to safely and effectively use medical technologies. You might do some of the physiological patient testing as well, help with some of the interventions. So people, perhaps one of the easiest one to mention is, for example, cardiac scientists who work with people who have pacemakers to make sure that they're optimally set and stuff like that. So it really depends on what specialism you work. But at the moment, I'm not working clinically, but I'm working in a group that evaluates evidence for medical interventions.
Okay, it's a very interesting area. So you're aware, or I think now anyway, that there is the beginnings of a process to introduce what's called assisted suicide, assisted dying, although it's probably, the bill allows for more than that. That distinction is maybe a false one, into Ireland. Recently, there was a debate over legislation in the United Kingdom regarding this issue. Just can you give me the rough headlines of what the form of that debate took in the United Kingdom?
So I'll just concentrate on one thing that's perhaps very recent and perhaps quite a telling example, and I'll just bring it up so that I don't say anything silly. One of the things that happened reasonably recently was a survey for members of the British Medical Association, looking at their opinions on the issue. And I think, a couple of interesting trends could be seen in that. And generally speaking, the statistics were slightly more in favor for what tends to be described as assisted suicide rather than euthanasia, hinting that perhaps people are more willing to let other people die and are still, it's probably a good thing, wary about performing the act themselves. And another thing is that there was a bit of a split about which professions tended to be more in favor of these, let's call them methods of assisted death. And it's quite interesting that, like, for example, oncologists, palliative care specialists, geriatricians in general, practitioners tend to be more opposed to them, as opposed to, for example, anesthetists and intensivists and obstetricians and gynecologists and emergency medicine specialists. So there were some trends in them. There were also trends regarding the younger generation and stuff like that. And interestingly, Northern Ireland doctors from Northern Ireland were generally more opposed than those from the other parts of the UK. So yeah, but I think the debate, I think about assisted dying in the UK in one form or another has been going on and on almost all the time. The Scottish Parliament had, I think, a debate on it. Let me just double check when it was. Because in 2010, I believe, they had a consultation as well, separately for Scotland. So it's been just going on and on. And, there's been a lot of campaigning from various groups, especially, also disability groups and stuff like that. So I think a lot of people are still feeling uneasy about it. But I think that's as much as can be said, about it at the moment. I'm not sure whether I think you really need a sociologist to to comment a bit more on how the trends have been changing, if they have been changing. That would be probably a better person to ask. But I think it's at least telling that with all the efforts to get these things through, it still hasn't gone through.
And it failed by a fairly substantial proportion when it came to Parliament, which is interesting. We think of the United Kingdom as a pretty typical, it's a liberal, secular society, and yet the arguments really failed to convince the members of Parliament. Do you think that was ultimately a sense, rather than an objection in principle to the idea of assisted suicide, but rather that the risks that are correlated with it outweigh the problem, the benefit?
I don't know, because I think it's a lot of speculation. You see, when I think about politicians, I generally think, about what will most likely get the most votes at the next election, rather than anything.
Well, that's a reasonable position. So you're saying you don't like Queen Elizabeth I. You do not have a mirror to see into men's souls. So you're not willing to speculate on their shall we say, their bona fides or not.
And I think it's just worth to highlight that on some of the more, let's call them pro-life issues, it's not necessarily either a party split. If I remember correctly, the pro-life group is shared between the different parties. I recall a survey saying that pro-life women were more likely to vote Labour, at least at some point in the past. I don't think the Conservatives are particularly socially conservative. So yeah, it's really hard to say. Obviously, like one of the more outspoken parliamentarians is Conservative, because the Conservatives have I think he's a Lord who has a disability, and he's quite outspoken, on a lot of these issues. But yes, again, I'm not sure how much it's a personal thing than a party thing.
Sure. So let's get on to the, shall we say, the substantial issue itself. I think what we would like to do, particularly from your expertise today, is to talk about what we're shall we say, to identify what we're talking about, what it is and what it isn't.
Yes.
What you consider to be morally problematic, and what we can look at as being morally acceptable when we're looking at the management of end-of-life care, if you like. And there's a tendency to mix up sort of what if we call extraordinary means, passive euthanasia, active euthanasia, assisted suicide, all of these. So if you could maybe spend some time talking about making those distinctions and the moral distinctions therein.
Yeah, so I think for me, like, you know, this is really the starting point of the debate. Well, I think perhaps the starting point of the debate is a bit more of a reflection about the nature of human person and society, but I think we'll probably get to that later. But it is a difficult issue, and I think there's a couple of ethical frameworks that are important to it. The first thing, of course, is to, as you say, distinguish between extraordinary and ordinary means. And at least in my opinion, it's I don't like to use the word ordinary care and to contrast it somehow with extraordinary medical interventions, because I think a framework that just concentrates generally on ordinary interventions and extraordinary ones is more philosophically consistent. I won't mention any references at the moment. I think we might maybe talk about some interesting things for people to read if they want later on. But I wish to perhaps start with some key points regarding extraordinary and ordinary care. So I'm going to just read a couple of quotes here just to use them as a background for anything that we might discuss later on. So ordinary means of conserving life may be defined as those means commonly used in given circumstances, which this individual in his present physical, psychological, and economic condition can reasonably employ with definite hope of proportional benefit. Extraordinary means of conserving life may be defined as those means not commonly used in given circumstances, or those means in common use, which this individual in his present state, physical, psychological, and economic condition cannot reasonably employ, or if he can, will not give him definite hope of proportionate benefit. So, and there's a couple of points that follow from these. First one is that a relative norm suffices in determining the means as ordinary or extraordinary means of conserving life. There is no absolute norm according to which certain means of conserving life are clearly ordinary for all men. A relative norm must be applied. It does seem that an absolute norm can be established according to which certain means of conserving life are clearly extraordinary means of conserving life. It would be allowable to establish a general norm in regard to ordinary means by which certain means of conserving life are characterized as ordinary means of conserving life for most men. So this is a lot, okay, lot to swallow.
Let's unpack that a bit.
But I'm going to briefly talk about, try to summarize it, what this means.
Okay.
So some treatments are just common, you know, we employ them common, and when I say treatments, I actually mean any sort of intervention. Mm-hmm. And they're common and usual, and it would be untypical to refuse them. Mm-hmm. So for example, feeding the hungry, you know, giving them water and so forth. You know, this is something that it's generally expected that most people should be given and that most people should accept. There are, you know, standard treatments for all sorts of diseases that might not be particularly burdensome, you know, that we would expect most people to take. You know, on the other hand, there are some very burdensome interventions, you know, very tricky surgeries with high risks, you know, that, you know, people might take up, but it wouldn't be unreasonable, you know, for them to not take them. And then there's all sorts of, and then there's like this area where sometimes the things in the first category either become ineffective or become burdensome. And what is, and it's important to consider, you know, to support their delivery, you know, for patients to get the appropriate psychological support. But it's also important to realize that sometimes they are so burdensome or so futile that actually their status can change for that particular person, that particular set of circumstances, to an extraordinary means.
So for clarity, what you're saying is, in the normal course of events, things like food and water are ordinary means.
Yes.
So, for example, when sometimes a decision is made with newborn infants to give what they call comfort care only, and they withhold food and water, that actually is withholding ordinary means.
Yes.
That would be
in general, it would be. But for example,
the context changes, and that changes those ordinary means into extraordinary means. Can you give me an example of a change, what kind of context change that might be?
So, for example, if you think maybe about a patient who has problem absorbing food, you know, like if you can't feed them, if feeding them is not effective, even though feeding is generally considered an ordinary means, there's no, you know, there's no reason to feed them if that's not an effective thing. That's perhaps like a crude example, but one that should be easily understandable. If you can't assimilate the food given to you, you shouldn't be forced to take food. Mm-hmm. But obviously, I think, excuse me, in a lot of cases when, you know, there was a big case in the UK, you know, years and years ago, where there was a patient in persistent vegetative state, and the court ruled that, you know, they could be essentially starved to death. You know, that's not a situation in which feeding stops being effective. You know, that's, even though that was a decision pretty much based on somebody's worth or the worth of their life. And when we're talking about interventions being ordinary or extraordinary, we should never evaluate them in the context of how much someone's life is worth, because, you know, you can't put, well, I'm sure some official somewhere does, but you shouldn't be putting, you know, a value on somebody's life, yeah, because people have an inherent dignity that's part of their being. But
that's true, but isn't it? It is also true that in normal business of a health system, like in the United Kingdom, they have, I think, what they call, is it QALYs?
Quality adjusted life years. There is QALYs. I don't think they're actually used in so much in actual like clinical decision making, at least I think officially, to my best of knowledge. I think they're used more in evaluating the economic values of whether an intervention should be sponsored or not. Of course, that doesn't stop people who debate issues like euthanasia and stuff like that to try to apply the QALY framework. But, you know, I think the quality framework in that sense is very dubious, because, you know, it seems to me that like people quite often think about people with Down syndrome as having a potentially, you know, low quality of life. But I'm not sure whether, you know, they necessarily view their lives as having a low quality, you know. And I think there's also a problem between, so I'll give you an example. In Aberdeen, where I did my PhD, there was a philosopher called Brainy, and he passed away during my time there. And he wrote a submission to that Scottish consultation on assisted dying. And if I recall correctly, one of the things he highlighted, because he had a bad accident and he became wheelchair bound, and that his you know, perspective of his life, you know, changed and improved with time, you know, as well. So one of the risks. So it's quite problematic about, you know, how do you evaluate it, because, you know, if somebody had an accident here and now, they might be, you know, obviously pretty depressed about it, but if they are given the right support, you might, you know, they might still, you know, have a, you know, a joyful life. And I'm not sure how easy it is for qualis to you know, capture that. I think that's a problem with a lot of tools like that. You know, it's the same problem with utilitarianism, you know, like how do you value how do you like put in objective numbers, like one aspect of your life compared to the other, you know, like how do you numerically weigh, you know, the friendships that you have with the health that you have, you know, with the education that you have, you know, how do you design a common denominator between them? You know, it's virtually impossible. So of course, you know, like people need to make economic decisions about funding treatments, you know, that are effective, because we have limited resources. And, you know, I would say it's illicit to triage medical, you know, if you have a limited amount of resources, that you give them to the people who will benefit the most, because, you know, that's what you're trying to do as healthcare providers. You know,
Yeah.
you have to do the best with what you have, and sometimes
resources are by their nature limited. Now, you've given us an example, for example, we talked about, say, food and water as being ordinary means, but say in the case of somebody who has grave difficulty and incapacity to absorb food, that changes the context where the administration of food goes from being ordinary to extraordinary. But we have a general idea of what would constitute ordinary means.
Yes.
So can we go on to then what you would consider extraordinary means, and what the consequences of extraordinary means have for the right to, say, to refuse those means?
I mean, the problem is, like, there's no minimal benchmark really that I can just like state that would give you like the lowest denominator of an extraordinary means. But anything that's like very, very burdensome could be considered extraordinary means. And in systems where you have to pay yourself, you know, something that's economically very expensive, you know, can be considered extraordinary means. So, for example, you know, if you're in unfortunate circumstances when you have to make a decision between taking medicine yourself or feeding your children, you know, that shifts the balance as well. But, you know, people, so there's a philosophical stance that's called vitalism, and that basically values raw life above everything else. So if you're a vitalist, you would do anything and everything, you know, to save someone's life, even perform, you know, some kind of horrific surgery on them that they might not wish to have, you know, like, but if you're consistently vitalist and you say, well, no, you have to defend life, whatever the cost, you know, you have to do that, however horrible, you know, the experience will be, however much burden you will impose on the patients by having, you know, repetitive procedures. And perhaps to put it in a slightly different context, so when you have palliative care, you know, people might have a choice with cancer, you know, take a drug that will have potentially extend their life by a couple of months, but has maybe big side effects, you know, or they can not take the drug and have palliative care that's supportive as much as they can. And you know, that's the difference, you know, like that treatment might have so many side effects, you know, might make the life that you'll have for those couple of months, you know, you might have raw life, but you might not be able to live it to the best. Whereas perhaps you take palliative care, and the time that you're given it, you can, you know, maybe you're elderly and maybe you can actually spend more time with your grandchildren and have, you know, better experiences with them and stuff like that. And that's obviously not to say that palliative care can sometimes have better effects than burdensome treatment in itself, you know, like we shouldn't be thinking about palliative care as like, you know, just leaving people to die without any interventions, you know, like palliative care is a bit more than that.
But I think yeah, I take your point that, but here we're talking ultimately about people making choices regarding their treatment, and these are based in the context of their lives, the prognosis, and the quality of their life. Now, how can we make a distinction therefore between that and what is being called assisted suicide?
Yeah, so I think when you're talking about assisted suicide or euthanasia, you know, the point of doing or the point of not doing something is that somebody dies, you know. The point of withdrawing care, so for example, you can have a patient who's receiving some form of support, but they're just like the way how they're receiving that support is burdensome to them. And sure, if you withdraw that support, they will die, but they don't want to die, you know. Like if you had an alternative form of support that wouldn't be burdensome, you know, they would take it. They're only refusing that form of support because it's just making them too tired, you know, too painful, whatnot. A person who's asking for assisted suicide is asking to actually die, you know, and that's the key. The key distinction is, you know, what is the aim of it? Is it to stop doing something that's burdensome, or is it actually to end life? And of course, sometimes, you know, it's tricky to draw a line, you know, with I don't know, for example, let's say pain medication. So you can provide somebody, you know, providing pain relief is a good thing, you know, like pain doesn't have, I would say, any inherent value, you know, like, so providing pain relief is good, but providing pain relief might actually risk, you know, shortening someone's life and stuff like that. And from an objective point of view, it might be hard to sometimes, you know, tell the difference whether whether a doctor tried to give good pain relief or whether he actually tried to kill the patient. But that's not to say that fundamentally there can be a distinction between intention, you know, that actually he did just try to relieve the pain, but circumstances were unfortunate, the patient died, or whether he tried to actively kill the patient. So I'm not going to pretend that, you know, it's always clear cut to see what somebody's intentions are. But like, if a patient is complaining about the burden of a ventilator, you know, and is clearly clearly still enjoying, but clearly still wanting to live, that's very different from them saying, oh, my life isn't worth, switch off that ventilator so that I can die. There are two different intentions, so I'm not sure whether that's a helpful distinction or not, trying to frame it that way, or whether it's not.
Is the idea of assisted suicide itself something of a misnomer, in the sense that what is being called assisted suicide ends up being direct killing by the doctor?
Yeah, so I think so there's a whole complex issue that we don't have enough time to dwell on in detail about cooperation with evil. And there's material and formal, and there's all sorts of distinctions being made. So for example, if you with the whole COVID vaccine thing and the HEC-293 cell line, there's like an old, it's not that old, I think it's from 2006 or something like that, Vatican document that talks about cooperation with evil. So I would say that, I don't think there's really like a substantial moral difference between like doing something bad and failing to do something good that you should be doing, and
what I've done and what I failed to do.
Yeah, and I don't think it's particularly virtuous to be like, to say, I haven't done that, I just help the patient to do it. So like I don't think there's an important moral difference here, whether a doctor is being complicit in euthanasia or whether they're complicit, at least formally, with assisted dying. And the only reason why I'm saying formally is that obviously you mentioned the case of doing the referrals and stuff like that, where doctors who are unwilling to participate in it are forced to refer to other practitioners.
We'll get on to that in a second. Okay, to try and tie this up a little bit. A phrase that we hear constantly used is that people have the right to die with dignity. And what they construe that right as to mean is that they have the right to ask the state to supply the means of their death in a certain way, so that they can die at a time and in a manner of their choosing. Do you think that such a right exists or can exist? Is it coherent to talk about that kind of right?
Well, I think, when you start talking about the right like that, you also start talking about the corresponding duty, that somebody somewhere has to do it. And I think it's a bit weird to start talking about that, some medical practitioner has a duty to help to kill a patient, or something like that. And I'm not really sure where this, I guess part of the problem is that, like saying, like if you just hear, if you are just like completely new to all of this and you hear the phrase dying with dignity, like, sure, it's a good thing, dignity is good. And, why would we want people to die in an undignified way? But I think, there's a loss of a general sense of human dignity that's perhaps, more at the root of all of this. And like, helping people to die, like, first of all, like, we should help people to live in a dignified manner, like support them, support the ill with all the, medical and psychological and spiritual and family and community support. And I think if that can be done, and, providing all the, and that includes providing all the licit means of supporting those dying people, you know, appropriate pain relief, appropriate everything, and showing the value of human life and human existence. You know, like it's a bit strange almost that like we're trying to like remove suffering from our side as much as possible. We're like suffering seems to be like, for better or worse, you know, quite the integral part of human life. And yeah, it's almost like this phrase of dying with dignity, like makes a lot of fun out of living with dignity. You know what dignity actually means, what is a good death, and a lot of concepts like these that I think, you know, people dwelled in ages past, and suddenly people decided that they don't exist anymore, and we shouldn't be looking at them. And I think it's a bit of a consequence of like the individualism that's rife in society. You know, like it's a bit you know, I have autonomy, I'm an autonomous being, you know, I have the right to this and that. But people forget that humans are, you know, are not only rational animals, you know, we're social animals. And as I'll probably switch the words around, but there's a famous philosopher, Alistair McIntyre, and he has a book, I think it's Rational Dependent Animals. And he highlights like that dependency is, you know, a key part of our human experience. So and what's particularly interesting in this debate is that, you know, autonomy tends to be talked about as one of the principles of medical ethics, along with three other things: justice, which is generally thought of as social justice, and non-maleficence and beneficence. And there's like a, let's call it almost like the standard textbook of medical ethics written by Bichams and Childress. And in society, everybody is, well, everybody, a lot of people seem to be very focused on autonomy, forgetting that autonomy is no less important than non-maleficence, for starters. And some people have even proclaimed that, you know, dignity, in the presence of autonomy, dignity is a useless concept. Now, first of all, what I would like to highlight is that, you know, with regards to non-maleficence, if you take any other medical intervention, death is generally an unwanted side effect. So within the concept of medicine, like to start to think as like that doctors should actively be helping patients to die, like with that being as their aim, is almost like switching medicine like upside down.
For clarity, we should say non-maleficence is basically the principle of do no harm.
Yes. So thank you for that. You know, like it's flipping medicine upside down, and it's, you know, what one of my dear colleagues wrote a paper on this, but like, how do you even test that the patient is better off when they're dead than when they were alive? Like, you know, like you know,
one to work out.
Like, do you send somebody, you know, to like Hades, you know, like filling out questionnaires, you know, like it's very
before we finish up there, I just want to two things. One, about reading materials, but just very quickly, I want to just your observations in the proposed bill here. The conscientious allowance is going to be the same as the conscientious allowance in the legislation which was introduced for abortion, which is basically to say a doctor can't be forced to perform an abortion, a doctor can't be forced to assist in a suicide or to, in fact, directly kill the patient. However, they will be expected, they will have a duty to refer the patient to somebody who will actually do the thing. I think a lot of people here think that is a very thin form of conscience protection.
It is, because it's almost making them cooperate with the act itself and facilitate it to some degree. It's also, like, I think, quite an interesting concept that, like, you have to refer to somebody who will do it. Like are the doctors meant to have, like, a list of people who they will know for 100% that they will like do it? Is that how it's meant to be working? Because you can still appreciate that like a patient, like, and I know that I've been going on how, like, assisted dying and euthanasia are not medical interventions, because that's medicine upside down. But, like, let's say you have a doctor who's not in principle opposed to assisted dying, but he deems that this patient does not meet the criteria. What are they meant to do? Like, send them to another doctor? And how are they meant to guarantee that they will say yes? I presume, like, those patients that would be eligible for this should meet some criteria. And it might be the case that they simply don't meet the criteria at all. Of course, like, I don't want to proclaim, like, who's committing sin and who's not committing sin, because, like, I think it's acceptable that doctors try to work well within frameworks that they have, and it might be the case that the law will be formulated in such a way that no pro-life doctor could ever work as a doctor, because they would be just trying to be mindful of this. But yeah, I think nothing stops a patient to go to see a different clinician. So I don't think it's necessarily a good thing to force doctors to refer them.
Yeah. So if anybody wanted to do some further reading on the subject, I know there are two different texts depending on, shall we say, the level of the preparation or the interest of the person that you might recommend. Yeah,
so I think for like the quotes earlier that were perhaps a little bit technical, but I still think it's a reasonably accessible book. It's this one. It's Conserving Human Life. It's published by the Pope John Center. You probably won't find a new print of this, but it has a couple of authors. The first one being Cronin, and it has his piece, who looks at the concepts of ordinary and extraordinary care, and then has two people who comment on that and how the application of that would look, and it has some Vatican documents at the end of it.
Okay. Cool.
If I think perhaps, like, if you're interested about the role of intentions and stuff like that, it's a much more technical read, though I found it quite enjoyable personally. I recommend The Theological Drama of the Moral Act by Stephen A. Long.
Stephen A. Long.
He is a professor. It doesn't deal in itself so much with the issues of assisted dying and stuff like that, but I think it's the basis of the framework that you utilize to see whether you could do some, whether an act could be performed or not.
Well, listen, it's been a fascinating introduction to the subject. Who knows, as the thing comes on, maybe we might come back to maybe the more specific set of questions. But for tonight, I'd like to again thank Dr. Michał
Michał.
I thought I did first Pruski, and I'd like to thank you for joining us again. I'd like to remind you, if you click that subscribe button, and if you'd like to help us in our campaigns for the coming winter, to click on the donate button, and anything you can give will be most welcome and will be used well. So thank you, Dr. Pruski, and thank you for joining us. Stay safe out there in this COVID world. Bye bye.
Thank you. You too. Bye bye.